Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. Our speakers today from the NAEd are myself, Maria Gann, Director of Professional Development Programs, and Angie Harmon, Program Officer. We are also joined by Dr. Margaret Eisenhart, who is the Chair of the Postdoctoral Selection Committee and University Distinguished Professor Emerita of Educational Anthropology and Research Methodology at the University of Colorado Boulder. If you have any technical difficulties with this webinar, please contact Zoom technical support at the number on the screen, 1-888-799-9666, option 2. As an overview of the webinar, we will discuss what to do if you experience technical difficulties with the presentation, provide a background on the postdoctoral fellowship, and go over the online application portal that you'll use to submit your application. The section on writing for your audience will be presented by Dr. Eisenhart. Finally, the last portion of the webinar is reserved to answer your questions. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour and will end by 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Just a few quick things before we get started. The audio for today's event will be streamed through your computer speakers. We'll be taking questions through the Q&A box located in the lower right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your question in the box and click Send. We do suggest waiting until the end of the online application portal section to ask any questions you have regarding the background of the fellowship or the portal itself, as your question may be answered during the presentation. Likewise, please wait until after Dr. Eisenhart's presentation for any questions on your narrative or writing to your audience. The webinar is being recorded. Please understand that any questions you submit may be read aloud and included in our recording. A link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides, will be posted on our website sometime next week. Once again, if you have any technical issues during the event, please contact Zoom technical support at 1-888-799-9666, option 2. Now that the technical information is out of the way, I'd like to welcome you once more to this webinar. Hopefully you are here to learn more about the NAEd Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. While our target audience is potential applicants, we may have deans, department heads, and other faculty signed on as well. Please note, if you are interested in the NAEd Spencer Dissertation Fellowship Program, we hosted a separate webinar on that program a couple of weeks ago on September 4th, and a recording is available on our website. The NAEd Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship is funded by the Spencer Foundation through a grant made to the National Academy of Education. The selection committee, comprised of 15 NAEd members and senior scholars, will name 30 fellows at the end of this application cycle. The fellowship is intended to support early career scholars as they complete a research project over a 1 to 2 year time frame, culminating with a publication such as a journal or book. The application includes several components: an online application form, project abstract, project description, a career statement, and reference letters. The last 3 components of the application that I mentioned are those that will take the most time and that we receive the most questions about, so I'll give you a little bit more detail about these. The project description is where you'll describe your research project, including the goals of the project, its contribution to the field, and the significance of the work, especially as it relates to education. The project description can be no more than 10 pages double-spaced. This is not a lot of space for all that you need to explain, so the description will likely be the component of the application you spend the most time on. Because the reviewers who will be reading your application come from a variety of disciplines, including your own, it is important to write the project description so that a broad audience could both understand the content and appreciate the importance of the project's potential impact. Next, in the career statement, we ask that postdoctoral applicants explain what led them to their current role as well as their interest in this particular project. I'll also note that throughout the application, we want to see that you're interested in building a career in education research. And then for the letters of reference, postdoctoral applicants must submit 3. There are no requirements in terms of who applicants choose, but we always recommend that you choose people who know you and your work well.
All right, so here's a screenshot of the fellowship application portal. The easiest way to get here is by visiting our website, www.naeducation.org, and following the links from the Postdoctoral Fellowship page. Depending on what web browser you're using, the portal may appear slightly different, but it should look very similar to this. Please keep in mind our eligibility requirements for this award. You must have had your doctoral degree conferred between January 1, 2014 and December 31st, 2018. Having your degree conferred means having the degree issued by the university and that you have it in hand. Applicants who graduated in 2019 will have to wait until next year to apply, and there are no exceptions to this policy. There are no residency restrictions for this award. You do not have to live in the United States, work at a U.S. institution, or have earned your degree in the United States. Nor are you required to have a formal institutional affiliation. Independent researchers may apply for the postdoctoral fellowship. IRB approval is required of fellowship applicants, but you do not have to submit that documentation with your application. Finally, concurrent funding is not permitted. If you are awarded funding for your project from this postdoctoral fellowship as well as another source, such as the Ford Foundation or IES, you must select only one source of funding for your project. If you experience any difficulties with the online application or something doesn't look right with the portal, please notify NAEd staff so we can assist you. It is very important that you make sure you are applying for the correct program. The name of the application is Postdoctoral Fellowship. If you are a previous applicant, you need to make sure you start a new application and not try to resubmit a previous one, as these will not be assessed. Reapplicants will need to provide a summary of previous applications. You can contact NAEd staff if you need any materials from a previous application. The application due date is November 20th, 2019, and the submission, including your references, must be complete by 5 p.m. Eastern Time. This is a hard date and time. No submissions will be accepted after the deadline, and NAEd staff will not make any edits or additions to your application after the deadline. A few more notes on the application portal. Please complete all required fields to submit your application. We also ask that you upload all documents in PDF form and make sure the PDF is not locked. This not only minimizes errors and difficulties for us down the line, but also streamlines your application review. It is very important, and we highly suggest you talk to your reference writers well in advance of preparing an application. You want to give them plenty of time to write a strong letter of recommendation, as the selection committee reviews these submissions critically. Remember, reference writers have the same deadline you do. The application portal will send an automated email when you input the names of your references with instructions and a link to upload their letters. Throughout the selection process, we will provide written updates via email. It is highly important that all email addresses you input are correct. Finally, to close out the overview of the application, 2 final notes. All application components, including the letters of recommendation, are due on November 20th, 2019 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. However, we suggest submitting your application well ahead of the deadline. The application portal sees a lot of traffic on the date of the deadline, and if your application is received after the deadline, it will not be considered. Additionally, since we are a small staff, we typically have a difficult time trying to keep up with all the applicants and recommendation writers who try contacting us on the due date. Please plan accordingly and have any questions addressed before the application deadline. With the application overview completed, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Eisenhart, who will talk more about your written narrative and your audience. Dr. Eisenhart?
Can you hear me? Just wanted to check.
Yes,
Okay. Okay. My job is to tell you a little bit about who your audience will be, meaning the audience who will read your proposals and evaluate them. As has already been said, there are 15 members of the selection committee, and they're all academics doing research in education. Some may be actually in education or related fields. And there are multiple disciplines represented on the selection committee. Each proposal has 2 readers from the selection committee. And ideally, those people are close to the applicant's area of work, but not necessarily in exactly your specific field. So it's important when you think about writing your project description in particular, that it's broad enough to appeal to and be understandable to a wide audience of academics doing research in education. It's also important that it be specific enough to address a particular issue or a particular set of research questions that relate to education. So in other words, you need to speak to 2 kinds of people really in writing your description. One is to the general selection committee, more diverse, and the other is to people who may be in your field or in closely related fields who will want to know more specifically what it is that you're doing in relationship to that field. As far as methodology, we have expertise from a wide variety of people on the selection, or wide variety of approaches on the selection committee. So there will be quantitative researchers, qualitative researchers, discourse analysis, analysts, and various people like that from the prominent methodological approaches in the education research field. Here again, it's important that you, when you write your description, you are addressing these 2 audience types that I mentioned before, the people who are generally in the field of educational research, and the people who are who might be practicing the particular methodological or analytical approach that you're taking. So just be aware of those 2 groups when you're writing this section of your description as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, what does your audience need to know? First of all, as I already alluded to, you need to locate yourself in a field of study. And remember that you're joining a conversation, and you want to make clear what you're bringing to that conversation. And that means that you show some appreciation of the history and background of that conversation, and you make clear what you are contributing, what new thing, what innovative or creative or promising idea you are bringing to that conversation. So obviously you need to know the history of the relevant ideas and the work. And I will say, though, that with respect to this, remember that you only have 10 pages in which to write your description. So your history really needs to be fairly brief, because you don't want to spend you don't want to spend 8 pages on history and then have only 2 left to tell what you're going to do. So the history or background information, the literature review, needs to be concise and relatively short, but to the point of exactly what conversation it is that you're entering, or the kind of contribution that you're trying to make to the field. Another thing that is important is that you make clear how the topic of your proposal is relevant to education. Now, for some of you, this may be very obvious because you are working in an education field or you identify with an education field. But we get a number of proposals from outside of education itself, so from sociology, anthropology, economics, history. So in those cases in particular, you need to be sure to tie your work and your purpose to education issues. And you want to make clear why the contribution that you're proposing to make will be important or consequential to education as a field, or educational research as a field. Another thing to speak to is whether your work and the results of the work will be useful to policymakers or practitioners. So the significance of your work to a larger audience beyond academic researchers is an important piece to include. And so, in terms of your application, and particularly your project description, you want to pay special attention to these characteristics or these items that are on this slide when preparing it. It's also very worthwhile if your letters of recommendation refer to some of these or all of these things as well. So it's useful to talk to your recommenders about the kinds of things that we've just been over so that they know what you're doing and what you're proposing and can, in a specific way, respond to or recommend you to the committee. Letters of recommendation that come from especially, well, this is most common when it occurs, which is you get very prominent people to write a letter of recommendation, but that person doesn't know your work very well, and and that person also does not write a very detailed or focused letter. So think carefully about the people that you ask to recommend you, and let them know what the criteria are. Let them know what you're trying to accomplish, and try to feel confident that they will be serious and give your letter a serious consideration. One important thing about that, too, is that you give your recommenders enough time to write the letter before the deadline. Don't ask them to do this the night before. You'll not be happy, probably, with the results. Okay, next slide. Okay. I think we have been over some of these points already. The multidisciplinary nature of the selection committee and the need to build a particular argument. Please avoid jargon. And when you are introducing terms or using terms that are not widely used in educational research, please define your terms. Also, if you're using a term that is controversial or for which there are many different definitions or conceptualizations, please be clear about how you are using that term. And what comes to mind immediately to me is a term like identity, for example, has many meanings. There's many different approaches to identity. And if you're using a term like that, it is really important that you make clear what you mean by it, and who are the other people who have been working in this area. So that allows the committee members to place your work. Be clear on the specific research questions that you have, and hopefully the research questions that you select are ones that will push the field forward, that will make a contribution, that will add something new and different to the field that you're in. On methodology, it's important, of course, that your methodology address the research questions that you have. So you want one or more methods that will help you answer the research questions that you have. You also need to be specific about your methods. If you say you're using something like discourse analysis, there again, that's a term that has many different approaches underneath it. And if you're using that type of approach, you need to make clear which one of those many things it might be is it in your case, and how are you going to implement that research approach, and that involves talking about how you're going to collect data and also how you're going to analyze the data that you collect. Think too about whether your methods are practical given the time, the resources, and the knowledge base that you have. You don't want to promise the world when you only have a year to do this project, or 2 years, depending on the situation. But be realistic about the methods that you're going to use and the amount of time that it's going to take to accomplish those methods, both in terms of collecting data and in terms of analyzing those data. Okay. Then on the timeline, I would just say be as clear as you can about the timeline so that you can make clear that you think you can complete the work within the fellowship year. Okay, next slide. The selection committee is not required to read appendices that you add to your application. Sometimes people read them, sometimes they don't. Usually, committee members will read the ones that they are most interested in themselves. But I would be judicious in including them. And certainly long, extended appendices are not appreciated. Remember that committee members are reading 20 or 30 or maybe even more of these proposals, and they're not excited in general to read lots of additional information. You should count on your project description to convey everything important that you need to convey about the project that you're proposing. Okay, next slide. So just in summary, start your application early. If you haven't already started, I'd start right after this workshop ends, this webinar. Know your audience and tell them everything they need to know to choose your project as one to receive a postdoc. Okay, next.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Eisenhart, very much. With that, we are going to turn to our Q&A session now. So if you think of any questions, please type them into the lower right-hand box. If you have questions that are specific to you, or if we don't get to your question in time, You can also email us. The email address is up on the slide, info@naeducation.org. All right, let's get started.
All right, so someone asked whether international applicants are expected to attend events at the NAED and whether these travel costs will be covered. So if you are selected as a finalist, yes, you will be expected to attend the events here, and we will provide the funding, the travel funding for those events. You do not need to budget that into the $70,000.
Okay. I have a question that might be appropriate for Dr. Eisenhart to answer. So the question is, for the sample of writing that we submit, given that the limit is 20 pages, and if we're submitting a published article, what parts of the article do you think would be most important to submit for reviewers to read?
I would say that the discussion of the research questions and, well, at least some of the conceptual background or theoretical background for the research questions, and the methodology, and then some indication of the results. I really think that if you're going to do something like that, it's worth your while to shorten whatever paper you have so that you can really zero in on the important information relevant to your proposal. If you can. If it's a published article and you want to submit it in full, then certainly you can do that. But, well, no, you can't do that because there's a 20-page limit. So, yeah, I would say just work on shortening it, and that might mean rewriting it some so that you address the key points that we talked about earlier and the ones that are relevant to the project that you're proposing to do next.
Great, thank you very much. We have a few questions that are kind of similar, asking about outside funding and whether or not it's possible to be conducting research that's not the Spencer grant while you have the Spencer grant. And then similarly, someone asking about how much of your time should be dedicated to our fellowship versus other responsibilities. So there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is that we are asking, and you are required to take the equivalent of 1 full academic year of full-time leave from teaching and administrative duties. So not just teaching, but also any administrative duties you have on campus. So that's something important to keep in mind. So I think the best scenario is that you take 2 semesters back-to-back of full-time leave from teaching and admin duties to work 100% on your NAED Spencer Fellowship. That's sort of the ideal scenario. Of course, we recognize that's not always possible. So instead, you might take 1 semester of full-time leave in the first academic year and 1 in the second academic year and teach in the other 2 semesters. That's perfectly fine. And then another situation that sometimes comes up but is not ideal is that you would do a part-time fellowship. So conduct the fellowship at 50% of your time for 4 full semesters back-to-back, so 2 full academic years, in other words. So the time constraint is one thing to keep in mind about other research you're doing, but another piece of this is that you cannot receive funding for the NAED Spencer Fellowship in addition to our funding. So let's say you have an NSF grant on a different project and you're a PI on that project while you're a Spencer Fellow. That is fine as long as you're considering this time constraint. So you can't be spending 75% of your time on one project and then 25% on ours. You really need to be focused on the research you're doing as your NAED Spencer grant. Another option, let's say you have received funding for this project that you're proposing to us. Maybe you can use that funding to collect the data, and then when you get our fellowship, you use our funding to analyze the data and spend time writing. So that's fine too. And if you have any questions about what other funding might conflict with ours, or how to organize the time of your fellowship, that would be something you should reach out to us about directly. We can talk through your options.
All right. So we have another question about a reasonable start date if you do receive this funding. So plausibly, most of the postdoctoral fellowships will start on September 1st, 2020. There is some flexibility there, so if you need it to start on another date within a reasonable timeline, you'll just work with us.
So someone asked, if you work in an institution where your annual salary exceeds the postdoc fellowship stipends, is the fellow required to work at a lower pay for the year of the fellowship? So normally what happens in this case is that you'll receive our $70,000 for the year, and then the university will top you up so that you're still receiving your normal salary. That is very common. So if you want to talk with us, or if you have any concerns about how your institution will handle this, we can speak offline.
All right, somebody asked if they should include a budget with the narrative. That is not required for your initial application. If you're selected as a semifinalist, I believe you're required to submit a budget then. All right, we had another question, whether letters of reference need to come from the same organization as the applicant. No, although it's quite likely that the people who know your work best are within your organization. And similarly, another question was asked, is it better to have various stakeholders and beneficiaries of the research writing these letters? And once again, this is really up to you, but choose people who know your work well and can speak to the importance of the work you're doing.
Someone asked, do you need a letter of support from your institution to apply? That's a great question. So we don't ask for that, but we do ask in the application whether you've talked with your dean or department head about taking the fellowship and whether they understand what would be required of you if you're selected. So if you are selected, what we'll do is we'll provide some information to you that helps guide you in your negotiation with your institution to take the leave. But it is, of course, important that you tell them that you're applying and also make it clear what the expectations of a fellow are. And then at the point of selection, we can work with you to make sure you're able to take the fellowship. And like I said before, if you need to work it out so that you're part-time or spreading it out over 2 years, that's completely fine.
All right, Margaret, we had a question for you. How specific should the timeline be in the narrative?
Well, I think the main thing is to indicate how you're going to move through the steps of your work and complete it by the end of the postdoctoral period. So if you are talking about things like when you're going to be collecting data or when you're going to be analyzing data, at that point you don't need to go into the details of what the collection will be or what the analysis will be, provided you've already explained that in your narrative. So you just need, I think, fairly general categories and a reasonable timeline for completing those things during that time period and finishing up when the fellowship is over.
So we had another question. Can the fellowship follow the awardee if they change institutions? Yes. What happens is the original institution will need to send us a check for the unused funds, and then we will reissue that. If you're a university-administered fellow, we will reissue that to your new institution.
What is the expectation for publications completed during the year of the fellowship? So that's a good question. In your project narrative, you obviously want to talk about the impact you see your project having on the field. And so oftentimes that impact takes the form of a journal publication, a book chapter, etc. That being said, we're not expecting you to finish that publication by the time the fellowship is over. The purpose of the fellowship is to give you a full year where you can focus on this research project. So you might be taking that year to collect data and analyze it. You might be taking that year to simply write a book chapter, a book, etc. So, it varies. The outputs vary depending on the fellow. But we do ask for interim report update where you tell us, what your progress has been so far. And then we ask for a final report at the end of your fellowship. And in that report, you'll tell us what you have published during the year you've been a fellow. But like I said, there's not necessarily an expectation that you've published something within that time period.
Could I just say one other thing about that?
Please.
When you're doing I probably should have said this earlier, but when you're writing your project description, you're talking about what you're going to do. It should be clear that you are doing something new that you haven't done before. For example, occasionally people apply who are writing a book and they want to finish the book during the fellowship year. And that makes sense to me if you have parts of the book that you haven't finished yet, you haven't done. But if you've done all the work or almost all the work, that's not going to be compelling to the selection committee for an application. So we want you to have done something, obviously, in the area of your research interest, and we want you to make clear what you have done. But we also want you to make clear what's additional, what's new, what's coming on top of what you have already done.
Dr. Eisenhardt, I kind of have a follow-up question, actually, that just came in similar line of thinking. How does an applicant's existing publication record fit into the selection committee's decision process?
Well, I think it depends. If your existing publication, it's good to have an existing publication record. Let me say that first. If your existing publication record is in the same general area of work as your proposal, then I think it's important to say that and make clear how you are building on what you've done before in this the proposal for the fellowship. I think if you're proposing something that's quite different from what you've done in the past, then the committee likes to see a publication record of some kind, but it's not going to be looking for particular publications that are in that exact area if you haven't really worked in that area before. So I do think it's important to have a publication record, and in your narrative to say something about the publication record. But how much you say about it really depends, I think, on how it relates to what the postdoc fellowship proposal is about.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful.
So we have a couple of questions about the funding. So the first question was, does the funding include any money to deliver interventions, money to train teachers or purchase instructional materials? And the second one asks if we can break down the stipend and whether you receive research funds. So you receive, every fellow receives $70,000. Some choose to take this entirely as a salary replacement, and some choose to use a portion or all of it as research funds. This is really up to you.
So someone is asking if we can clarify why we have this 5-year gap during which you have to have received your PhD, and why that gap prevents you from applying until you're 1 year out from your PhD. So essentially the reason we have this is because we found that most of our applications come from applicants who are currently based at a university. Not all, but most of them do. So we find that it's much easier for applicants and for fellows when they've had a year outside of their PhD to have found a position, so that you're not applying to jobs and applying to this at the same time. And then you've also been at your university for a little bit of time, which means it's more likely they'll let you take the leave for the fellowship. So that's the reason why we do that. Someone asked if we have preference between whether an applicant proposes to conduct the study over 1 year or 2 years, so 1 year full-time or 2 years part-time. No, we do not have a preference. This does not impact your likelihood of being selected. I think it's easier for someone to take the 100% full-time simply because if you start teaching one class and you have some administrative duties, that often does end up being more than 50% of your time. So for the sake of you, I think full-time is ideal, but again, this won't impact our decision and who we select, and we will work with you to make it work even if you do need to do part-time. Dr. Eisenhart, we have a question here for you. Do you have any advice on determining how broad or extensive the research plan should be? Obviously, these are complex issues to be researched and can take a whole career. How can we determine where to draw the line for the one-year plan?
Well, I think that basically you need to think, if you have a complex issue that you're addressing and plan to work on for a while, you need to decide on the piece that you can do or that you want to do during the fellowship year. So it's not necessary, if you have a research agenda that is fairly complex and and you're imagining working on it over a long period of time, I would say break it down into phases or sections. And you've got to do that anyway, just as a practical matter. But decide on the piece that you're going to work on during this fellowship year, and write about that piece. So you don't have to talk about all the different research questions that you might address. You don't have to talk about all the different methodologies that you might use in the larger research agenda that you have. You only need to talk about the ones that are specifically related to what you're going to do during that fellowship year.
So, Dr. Eisenhart, we have another one for you. So on the online application form, we have a two-part question. The first part says, most scholars now believe, ... and the applicant fills out that portion of the question. And then the second portion is, as a result of my study, ... So in other words, what is the current state of the field as it relates to the topic area, and then how will the study impact the field? And the applicant is wondering, how different should the content of these questions be in relationship to the content of the project narrative? So should they repeat themselves, in other words, or do you see these questions serving a different role from the project narrative?
Generally, I see these questions as being at a somewhat more general level than the project description. But I will tell you that at least the way I read these proposals, I start at the top and I go through them. And these two questions are near the very beginning. So they do help orient me to what it is that I'm looking for or going to be finding in these proposals. And so I would say, first of all, give some thought to what you say in response to those two prompts. And make it needs to be fairly short, concise, to the point, but think about people being introduced to your contribution with your answer or by your answers to these two questions. And then I would say if there's a bit of repetition in your proposal as a whole, in your project description, that's fine. But I think that the answers to those two questions are actually quite important, and that you should give some careful thought to what you want to say there, so that you create in your reader's mind the idea that you have thought seriously about this, and you know that you're trying to make some kind of contribution that has not been made before.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful.
Another question is, are universities allowed to take indirect costs from our fellowship funds? This is interesting. You have a wide latitude in the things you can use your fellowship funds for, but no, your institutions may not take indirect costs out of your fellowship funds. This is one of the very few things we cannot fund. Another question was whether the type of institution you're at matters in the decision process. For example, would an applicant at an R1 be as competitive as an applicant at an R2? So what matters to us is diversity of many kinds, and that includes geographic and institutional diversity. We recognize that it can be difficult for students at R2 institutions to get this sort of funding. So we look very carefully at all applications to make sure that we can have diversity in our pool of finalists.
Dr. Eisenhardt, another question for you. What are your thoughts on a proposal with 2 to 3 smaller but interrelated studies?
I think that's fine. I don't have any objection to that at all, as long as it's clear what what the purpose of the study's purposes are, and how they fit together, or how, as a whole, they contribute to something that you're a longer-term project that you're working on. I think that would be fine.
We have a couple questions from people who are not based at institutions that are at universities. So you definitely can apply. Certainly you're eligible. I would say it just happens to be that most of our applicants come from faculty members. But a couple things to note. This funding is meant to support you in your project, in an independent project. So the funding can't be supporting a nonprofit's project, for example. But if you're at a non-university institution like a research institute or an NGO, and you want to be institutionally administered in your fellowship, that's fine. So I don't think we mentioned this before, but fellows have the option of either getting the funds sent to them directly or getting the funds sent to their institution. And if you are at an NGO or a non-university institution, you can also have the institutionally administered option, in other words. And then similarly, someone asked, how is the funding dispersed if you're selected? So it's a $70,000 grant, and you get 2 payments of $35,000 if you're an institutionally funded awardee. If you're a self-administered awardee, we break it up into 4 payments. And it depends on if you're conducting it over a year or 2 years when you get the funding. Sorry, we're just going through the questions here.
I can make another comment in the interim here.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Just about the, and this to some extent has to do with the question about if there's any priority given to R1 institutions versus others. And as I was answered, I think that we are very interested in the diversity of institutions and people and research questions. But I would say for everyone that it's really valuable, I think, to show your proposal in advance to some people at your institution or at other institutions who work in your area, so that you can get some feedback on the project description in particular from people who are more senior than you. I think it's really worthwhile to do that for a number of reasons. It gives you a broader audience to start with of people who are looking at your proposal and thinking about ways to strengthen it. It also gives you the benefit of different kinds of expertise, or people with different kinds of expertise who can comment on different aspects of your proposal. So I would highly recommend that you ask for feedback on your proposal before you submit it.
Great. All right. Can I include data purchase costs in the budget? Yes, you may do that. You may choose to spend your funds in that way. Another question was, does the research need to be approved by our IRB when we submit the proposal, or could we wait until it is awarded or some other time point? It's not necessary that you have the IRB at the same time you submit your application. We need to have the IRB on file with us before we can actually start your fellowship, but that's later down the line.
So someone asked about the timeline of notification. So the due date is, like we said, November 20th, and then we go into our first stage of the review process, and you'll find out if you're a semifinalist or not in late February or early March. And then those who are semifinalists will be notified of their final status in, usually it's early May that you would find out.
All right, so we had another question about whether it would be useful to describe or identify people who will mentor you during your fellowship project. I'm happy to take this question. I work on the mentorship process. That is part of your fellowship. Should you be selected, later on in the process, as we're planning for the retreats, you'll be given the opportunity to select a few potential mentors from the list of NAEd members and former fellows who said they're available to attend. So that's handled later.
Someone is asking, what are the materials that an applicant's reference will be asked to deliver? So what you'll do is in your application, you'll enter the names and email addresses and titles of your 3 referees. And then those people will receive an email from Open Water, which is our application portal, with instructions on how to submit their letter of reference. So what they'll do is they'll submit a PDF letter of reference, but they'll also be asked to rate the applicant and the application. So it's 2 separate ratings on the quality of you as an applicant and a scholar, and then on the quality of the proposal. And then the 2 ratings, as well as the letter of reference, will be reviewed by the selection committee. So there's a couple of pieces to that. If your referees have any trouble uploading the letter, they can email us and we can help them. It's no problem at all. And I'd also just note sometimes the emails from Open Water go to spam or junk folders. So make sure they check those if they haven't received them yet. Dr. Eisenhart, we have a question for you here. Is the selection committee particularly keen to see projects that address issues of equity or social justice in education?
Yes, I think that the committee is keen on those topics, and I would encourage you to submit proposals that have to do with equity issues and social justice.
Okay, great, thank you. So a question here, how is it decided which committee members read our proposals? So the way the process works is that after the deadline, NAED staff will go through all the proposals to make sure they're complete and eligible, and then we will assign the proposals to selection committee members based on discipline and methodology. So each proposal will be read 2 times by 2 separate selection committee members. Then the selection committee will meet in February to have a 2-day meeting during which they discuss the proposals and the applications. So we do assign you initially based on discipline and methodology, but I will say that during the selection committee meeting, the selection committee is really careful to talk in depth about the applications. And if there's a situation in which the readers who reviewed the application are seeking perspective from a third person on the committee, we often will have that person read your application that evening, and then they'll talk about it the next day. So they really do they're very thorough in their review of the applications. So after that first meeting, they will determine who the 60 semifinalists are, and then those 60 people will be read by 2 additional people. And those 2 additional people are also our NAEd members who are not on the selection committee. And then the way we match them is that during the selection committee meeting, the first one, those selection committee members will suggest NAEd members who would be appropriate readers for that application. And then at their final meeting in April, they will look at all of the reviews together and have another conversation about who they feel merits being awarded. Okay, so Dr. Eisenhart, another question for you. If an applicant currently has funding for a project's data collection and the person is proposing to use the NAEd Spencer Fellowship for analysis and writing, do you have any suggestions on how to make it clear about what has been done so far and what needs to be done through the fellowship? Or in other words, distinguishing between what they've done with funding they've already received and then what they plan to do with our funding.
Well, I think you just need to make that clear in your proposal. I don't know really I have much else to say about that except just to clarify what you have and what you're using it for and what you'll be doing with that during the fellowship year, and then distinguish that from what you are proposing for the fellowship itself.
I actually had a quick question. Does the 10-page double-spaced description also include the references? You are allowed 1 additional page for references.
Someone asked if we would recommend including a supporting letter from schools as an appendix if our proposal includes data collection or developing partnerships with schools. I definitely think that would be an appropriate thing to include, but I would also mention in your project narrative that you have already developed this relationship with the schools and have a supporting letter in your application, simply because, as Dr. Eisenhart said, the selection committee is not required to review the appendices, and I think having the support of these schools is very important to your project and would make your application stronger.
Yeah, I would just add to that if you do already have relationships with schools or with policy agencies or access to a database of some kind, please tell us that, because that makes it clearer that you are you have the sort of necessary foundation to get this proposal done.
Great, thank you. Someone asked what the advantages and disadvantages are of a self-awarded or self-administered fellowship versus institutionally administered. So that's a good question. So I would say, first of all, if you are choosing a self-administered fellowship, you need to think about what that means for how you file your taxes that year, because you are an individual grantee. I will say, though, NAEd cannot provide any tax advice to you because we're not tax professionals. So we do advise that you talk with a tax professional about that in order to figure out the implications for yourself. But I would say most of our fellows do institutionally administered awards simply because it is an easier process for them or just for the university. So it's really up to you how you want to handle this, and we'll work with you to make sure it all, it all works out. All right, we are a minute over time, so I don't want to keep you any longer, but I want to say thank you so much to Dr. Eisenhart for sharing your tips and advice with applicants. We really appreciate it. And I know we didn't get to a lot of these questions, so please send us an email at info@naeducation.org, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. The webinar will be recorded and posted on our website within the week. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.